Xavier Shaw, a successful black CEO, returns to his small hometown of Millbrook, only to face intense racism and systemic corruption. Despite his wealth and status, he's relentlessly targeted by local law enforcement, including a racist police officer, and undermined by the very town he grew up in. As Xavier navigates public humiliation, covert racism, and sabotage, he must confront the prejudice that runs deep in the town, challenging everything he's worked for. His struggle reveals the harsh reality of racism in America, forcing him to question whether true justice is even possible. The early morning sun filtered through the dense fog, hovering over the small town of Millbrook, its golden light casting long shadows over weathered brick buildings and empty sidewalks. Marcus Daniels stepped out of his sleek black SUV, his tailored suit catching the light. As CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in the country, Marcus exuded confidence and power. Yet, his presence here, a town that hadn't changed much since the 1950s, felt like an anomaly. Marcus adjusted his tie and looked up at the imposing courthouse in front of him. Its faded facade and creaky wooden doors seemed to groan under the weight of years of unresolved conflict. He had spent the past decade building an empire in Silicon Valley, turning ideas into innovation, and lifting his family out of poverty. Yet, despite his wealth, he chose to live modestly, avoiding the ostentation that often came with success. This trip to Millbrook wasn't about business or luxury, it was personal. Marcus had returned to attend the reading of his late uncle's will, a man who had raised him during the hardest years of his life. The Daniels family had deep roots in Millbrook, but Marcus's achievements had often been met with quiet resentment from the locals. His success stood out in a town where old money and entrenched power defined the social hierarchy. As Marcus approached the courthouse steps, he noticed the stairs. A group of men lingered outside a nearby diner, their conversation halting as they watched him pass. Their faces betrayed a mix of curiosity and contempt. Marcus was used to this. His presence, a black man in a custom suit stepping into spaces they believed weren't meant for him, always drew attention. He ignored the whispers and pushed open the courthouse door. Inside, the atmosphere was stark and unwelcoming. The musty air carried the faint scent of old wood and mildew. A receptionist sat behind a counter, flipping through a magazine, her gaze barely lifting as Marcus approached. "I'm here for the Daniels will reading," he said, his voice calm but firm. The receptionist finally looked up, her eyes scanning him with thinly veiled skepticism. "Name?" "Marcus Daniels," he replied, enunciating clearly. Her brows furrowed, and she glanced at her computer. After a moment, she nodded and gestured toward a waiting area. "Take a seat, they'll call you when it's time." Marcus thanked her and walked to the row of uncomfortable chairs lining the wall. He could feel the receptionist's gaze lingering on him, her eyes silently questioning what someone like him was doing here. The small-town dynamics hadn't changed, it seemed. As he sat down, a middle-aged man in a sheriff's uniform entered the room, his boots clacking against the tiled floor. His name tag read, Daniels. "Officer Daniels," Marcus noted with a flicker of irony. The man's sharp eyes swept the room, landing on Marcus. He paused, his expression hardening. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, his tone curt. "I'm waiting for the will reading," Marcus replied evenly. Officer Daniels narrowed his eyes, his hand resting on his belt. "You don't look like you're from around here." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I grew up here. My uncle, Henry Daniels, passed recently." The officer's expression didn't soften. Instead, he studied Marcus for a moment longer before muttering, "Well, just make sure you're where you're supposed to be." The tension in the air was palpable, but Marcus simply nodded. He had learned long ago not to let moments like this derail him. Still, the interaction reminded him of why he had left Millbrook in the first place. The courtroom door creaked open, and a woman in her late 40s, dressed in a sharp gray suit, stepped out. "Mr. Daniels, we're ready for you." Marcus stood, his broad shoulders straightening as he walked past the officer. The man's gaze burned into his back, but Marcus didn't give him the satisfaction of looking back. The reading itself was uneventful, though the weight of his uncle's legacy hung heavy in the room. Marcus inherited the family home, a modest property on the outskirts of town, along with a piece of land that had been in the family for generations. As the lawyer explained the details, Marcus felt a pang of emotion. His uncle had worked tirelessly to keep that land in the family, a symbol of resilience in a town that had never fully accepted them. After the meeting, Marcus found himself back outside the courthouse. The group of men at the diner was still there, their laughter cutting through the crisp air. He ignored them and headed to his car, but as he reached for the handle, a voice called out, "Hey, Daniels!" Marcus turned to see Officer Daniels striding toward him, his expression unreadable. The men at the diner stopped talking, their attention now fully on the unfolding scene. "Something wrong, officer?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone neutral. The sheriff stopped a few feet away, his posture imposing. "Just wanted to remind you to watch yourself while you're in town. Folks here don't take kindly to strangers poking around where they don't belong." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "I'm not a stranger, officer. This is my hometown." The officer's lips curled into a smirk. "Hometown or not, don't think your big city success makes you untouchable." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marcus held his ground, his calm exterior masking the anger simmering beneath. He had dealt with people like Daniels his whole life, men who used their power to intimidate, to remind him of the barriers they believed he couldn't cross. "I appreciate the advice," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "But I don't plan on causing any trouble." Daniels tilted his head, his smirk fading into a hard line. "Good. Keep it that way." As the officer walked away, Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing only slightly. He climbed into his car, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. This trip to Millbrook was supposed to be about honoring his uncle's memory. But it was clear that his presence had already stirred the pot. Driving away from the courthouse, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how little had changed in Millbrook. The prejudice, the small-mindedness. It was all still there, festering beneath the surface. But he wasn't the same kid who had left all those years ago. He was stronger now, and he had no intention of letting the town's hostility define his return. As he turned onto the quiet street leading to his uncle's home, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This trip might have begun as a matter of family obligation, but it was quickly becoming something more. Millbrook's challenges weren't unique. They were a microcosm of the systemic issues that plagued communities across the country. And Marcus Daniels wasn't one to back down from a fight. Marcus parked his car in front of the Daniels family home, its familiar silhouette casting long shadows in the waning afternoon light. The modest house was exactly as he remembered. The peeling white paint, the rickety porch swing, the small but well-tended garden his uncle had taken pride in. Yet, it now seemed out of place amidst the creeping gentrification overtaking the neighborhood. Newly renovated houses with sprawling driveways stood in stark contrast to his uncle's home, their owners rarely venturing to acknowledge their surroundings. As Marcus approached the front door, a neighbor across the street, a middle-aged white woman watering her flower beds, paused mid-spray to watch him. Her brow furrowed in suspicion, her eyes narrowing as if trying to place him. Marcus offered a polite nod, but she didn't respond, her hand tightening on the hose. He unlocked the door, stepping into a wave of nostalgia mingled with sorrow. The air inside smelled faintly of his uncle's aftershave, and the creak of the floorboards under his feet brought back memories of summers spent here. But as much as the house offered comfort, it also bore the weight of responsibility. His uncle's will had left him more than just a property. It had handed him a legacy. Marcus busied himself with sorting through papers left on the dining table, but a sharp knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He frowned, glancing at his watch. It was unusual for anyone to visit unannounced, especially in this neighborhood. When he opened the door, 2 police officers stood on the porch, their postures stiff and imposing. "Good evening, sir," one of them began, his hand resting casually on his holster. "We received a call about a suspicious individual entering this property. Can we ask what you're doing here?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he forced a calm expression. "This is my house. I just inherited it from my uncle." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "Do you have any proof of that?" Marcus resisted the urge to sigh. "I have the will and legal documents inside. Would you like to see them?" The officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Marcus's composure. "Yes, that would be helpful." Marcus stepped back, motioning for them to enter. The officer scanned the room as if expecting to find something incriminating. Marcus retrieved the documents and handed them over, keeping his movements measured and deliberate. The officer read through the paperwork, his expression neutral, but tinged with reluctance. "Looks like everything checks out," he admitted, handing the papers back. "But you can't be too careful around here." Marcus tilted his head slightly, the hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I appreciate your diligence, but I assure you, I'm exactly where I belong." The officer's jaw tightened, his authority slightly undermined. "Just doing our job, have a good evening." As they left, Marcus closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. The interaction had been brief, but exhausting. Moments like these were nothing new. He had faced them in boardrooms, at airports, even in his own neighborhood. Each instance was a reminder of how quickly his identity could be reduced to suspicion in the eyes of others. The next morning, Marcus decided to visit the local hardware store to pick up supplies for repairs on the house. The store, a small family-run business, was one he remembered from his childhood. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the smell of sawdust and paint filled the air. He approached the counter where a wiry older man stood, flipping through a catalog. "Morning," Marcus greeted. "I'm looking for some paint and tools for a few repairs." The man glanced up, his eyes flicking over Marcus's suit before narrowing. "You sure you're in the right place? We don't sell anything fancy here." Marcus smiled tightly. "I'm not looking for fancy, just functional." The man shrugged and gestured toward the aisles. "Tools are down that way, paint's in the back." Marcus nodded and made his way through the store, picking up the items he needed. As he approached the counter to check out, he noticed another customer, a white man in a plaid shirt, receive a warm greeting and friendly banter from the store owner. When it was Marcus's turn, the man's demeanor shifted back to wary professionalism. "That'll be $98.50, the man said curtly. Marcus handed over his credit card, but the man frowned as he swiped it. "Declined," he announced loudly, though the receipt printer had already started whirring. Marcus frowned. "That's not possible, try again." The man sighed, his tone impatient. "Look, maybe you've got another card, we don't take kindly to bounced payments." Before Marcus could respond, the receipt printed, confirming the transaction had gone through. The man glanced at it, his face flushing slightly, but he said nothing. Marcus pocketed the receipt and gathered his items, meeting the man's gaze. "Looks like it worked after all," he said evenly, before walking out. Back at the house, Marcus unloaded his purchases, but his mind lingered on the interactions of the day. They were small slights, the kind that might seem insignificant to some, but they accumulated, each one chipping away at his patience. He reminded himself why he was here, why he needed to honor his uncle's memory and confront these challenges head-on. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. He wanted to reacquaint himself with the place he had once called home. The streets were quieter than he remembered, but the underlying tension was palpable. A few neighbors stood on their porches, their conversations halting as he passed. Some offered tight smiles, others simply stared. As Marcus turned a corner, he spotted a group of teenagers, loitering near a corner store. They were loud, their laughter echoing down the street, but their energy shifted when they noticed him. One of them, a tall boy with a baseball cap tilted low, called out, "Hey, who do you think you are, walking around here like you own the place?" Marcus stopped, his expression calm but firm. "I'm Marcus Daniels, and I do own a place here." The boy scoffed, but before he could respond, an older man, a store employee, stepped outside. "You kids better clear out before I call the cops." The group dispersed, but not before one of them muttered, "This place ain't for you, man." Marcus continued his walk, but the weight of their words clung to him. It wasn't just the kids, it was the entire town. A place that had raised him, yet seemed determined to reject the man he had become. But Marcus wasn't one to back down. If Millbrook wanted a fight, he was ready. The next day, Marcus decided to meet with the town's mayor, hoping to discuss opportunities to give back to the community. He had plans to turn his uncle's land into a community center, a space for education, innovation, and growth. But as he entered City Hall, the receptionist informed him that the mayor was unavailable, despite Marcus having scheduled the meeting weeks in advance. "He's in a meeting," she said with a clipped tone, not meeting his eyes. Marcus glanced at the clock on the wall. "I'm 15 minutes early, I don't mind waiting." She pursed her lips. "His schedule's packed, you might want to come back another time." The dismissal was clear, but Marcus remained polite. "I'll wait." 2 hours passed before the mayor finally appeared, his expression one of mild annoyance. "Mr. Daniels," he said, extending a hand. "Sorry for the delay." The meeting was brief, and the mayor's interest in Marcus's proposal was superficial at best. His comments were laced with condescension, his promises of support non-committal. As Marcus left City Hall, he felt the frustration building inside him. Millbrook wasn't just a town stuck in its ways, it was a town actively resisting change. But Marcus wasn't deterred. He had faced obstacles before, and he knew the only way to overcome them was to confront them head-on. The tension in Millbrook had been building for weeks, but it wasn't until the town hall meeting that Marcus felt the full weight of what he was up against. He had gone in with a hopeful heart, eager to discuss his plans to convert his uncle's property into a community center, but the reception he received was colder than he anticipated. The mayor, a man who had claimed to be an advocate for progress and revitalization, had shown little more than a veneer of politeness during their meeting. "I appreciate your vision, Mr. Daniels," the mayor had said, his eyes glancing briefly at the papers Marcus had handed him. "But I'm not sure Millbrook is ready for such a drastic change. People here are comfortable with the way things are." Those words rang in Marcus's mind as he walked out of the building. The meeting hadn't just been a rejection of his ideas, it had been a rejection of his very presence in the town. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the mayor was merely a pawn in a much larger game, a game where power was concentrated in the hands of the few, and people like Marcus were seen as nothing more than obstacles. As he reached his car, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Officer Daniels. "Mr. Daniels," the officer greeted with a thin smile. "I didn't expect to see you here. You look upset." Marcus turned to face him, his fists clenching involuntarily. Officer Daniels had made his feelings clear in the past. He was one of the many who saw Marcus's success as an affront to the natural order of things in Millbrook. "I'm fine," Marcus said, trying to maintain control, but the frustration in his voice betrayed him. "I just thought this town could do better, that's all." "Better?" Officer Daniels chuckled, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe what this town needs is to keep things just the way they are. Don't fix what isn't broken." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but held it in check. "You don't know what's broken here, officer. You don't even see it." "I see enough," Daniels replied, stepping closer. "I see people like you trying to come in here and disrupt everything. This town's always been fine without you and your kind." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The words were casual, but they carried a venomous weight behind them. An unmistakable reminder of the racism that had always been present in the town, simmering just beneath the surface. Officer Daniels wasn't just a cop, he was a symbol of the very system Marcus was trying to challenge. "Don't talk to me about my kind," Marcus said coldly, his voice steady despite the rising anger. "I've worked harder than anyone in this town, and I've earned every bit of success I have." Daniels laughed, shaking his head. "Success? It's easy to call it success when the rules are rigged in your favor, isn't it?" Marcus clenched his jaw, his fists at his sides. He knew this conversation was going nowhere. Officer Daniels wasn't going to change, but something in Marcus snapped. He wasn't going to back down any longer. "Get out of my way," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. Daniels didn't move, but instead, his smile widened. "You think you can talk to me like that? I think you've forgotten your place, Marcus." Before Marcus could respond, Daniels stepped forward, his hand reaching for his radio. "I think it's time we had a little chat about your success, and whether or not it's really legal." The officer's hand hovered over his radio as Marcus's heart raced. He knew exactly what this was. It was an intimidation tactic. Daniels was leveraging his authority, hoping to provoke a reaction. But Marcus wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. "Don't even try it," Marcus said, his voice calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. "You don't want to go down that road." Daniels paused, his eyes narrowing, then he smirked. "We'll see about that." The next few days were a blur of stress and mounting tension. Marcus had hoped his encounter with Officer Daniels would be a one-off, but he could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just Daniels anymore, it was the entire system. The town was built on old, unspoken rules that had kept people like Marcus at the margins for generations. The wealth he'd earned, the life he'd built, all seemed like an affront to that delicate balance. If he wasn't careful, he might just lose everything. One afternoon, Marcus received a call from Mitchell, a local lawyer who had been advising him on his plans for the community center. Mitchell's voice sounded strained, an undercurrent of panic seeping through his calm demeanor. "Marcus, you need to be careful," Mitchell warned. "There's been talk around town. People are worried about what you're trying to do with your uncle's property. The mayor, Officer Daniels, and some of the other big players. They're not happy about it, and you're starting to stir up something they're not prepared to deal with." Marcus's stomach churned. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you're a threat, Marcus," Mitchell said bluntly. "And threats don't get to go unchallenged in this town. They'll do whatever it takes to stop you, even if that means going after you personally." Marcus's mind raced. He had known things wouldn't be easy, but this was more than he had anticipated. He wasn't just fighting against apathy or indifference. He was fighting against a system that was actively trying to crush him. "I can handle it," Marcus said, though his words felt hollow even to him. "I've been through worse." Mitchell hesitated. "Be careful, Marcus. You've got a lot at stake. If they target you, it won't just be your business. They'll come for your reputation, your freedom. They won't stop until they destroy everything you've worked for." A few days later, Marcus's worst fears began to unfold. He was on his way to the local courthouse to meet with another potential ally when a police car pulled up beside him. The officer behind the wheel was none other than Officer Daniels. "Marcus Daniels," Daniels called out as Marcus approached, his voice tinged with mock politeness. "We need to have a word with you." Marcus's stomach dropped. He had seen this coming, but the suddenness of it all was still a shock. "What's this about, officer?" Daniels didn't answer directly. Instead, he simply gestured for Marcus to get into the back of his squad car. "I'm not getting in your car," Marcus said, his voice steady, but his heart was hammering in his chest. "If you've got something to say, say it." The officer's eyes flickered with annoyance. "You're making a mistake, Marcus, but I'll give you a choice. Either you get in the car, or we'll have to handle this the hard way." The implication hung in the air, and for a moment, Marcus felt like the world was closing in. This was it. The breaking point. Everything he had fought for, everything he had worked toward, could come crumbling down with a single decision. But Marcus didn't back down. He took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "I'm not afraid of you, Daniels. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me why I'm being detained." The officer's hand twitched toward his radio, but Marcus held his ground. "I'm not the one making the mistake," Marcus said. "You are." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, Daniels let out a sharp breath and took a step back. "You think you're untouchable. That's your problem. I'll make sure you regret this, Marcus." Marcus didn't respond. His eyes locked on Daniels as the officer climbed back into his car and drove off. The silence that followed felt suffocating, the weight of the threat hanging heavy in the air. As Marcus stood there, his mind raced with possibilities. He had a choice now. He could either back down and let the system swallow him whole, or he could take a stand. His resolve hardened. He wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. The time had come to fight back. But how? The tension in Millbrook was like a pressure cooker, and Marcus Daniels could feel the heat rising. His life had always been about overcoming obstacles, but the forces he was now up against were larger, darker, and more entrenched than anything he had ever faced. The town had always been small and quiet, but there was something insidious lurking beneath its peaceful exterior, a system that protected the powerful, while crushing anyone who threatened to disrupt it. It all came to a head the following week, when Marcus received a phone call from Mitchell, his lawyer, with news that shook him to the core. "Marcus, you need to hear this." "I just got wind of something," Mitchell's voice crackled over the line, urgency clear in his tone. "The town council is preparing to sabotage your plans. They're talking about finding a way to block your project legally. If they succeed, you'll be buried under paperwork, red tape, and maybe even false accusations. They'll try to make you look like you're in over your head. And I've heard whispers that they might even involve the police. Daniels is already on the move." Marcus's gut twisted. This was no longer about just a community center. This was about survival. His survival, the survival of his business, and the chance to show the people of Millbrook that change was possible. It wasn't just the mayor or the town council. It was the entire power structure that had made sure people like him stayed in their place. "Mitchell, we need to move fast," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside. "I won't let them bury me without a fight." He spent the next few days assembling a team of allies, reaching out to other business owners and community leaders who had supported his project. But Marcus knew he was fighting an uphill battle. The more he dug into the town's records and history, the clearer it became that the fix was in the town council, the police, and even some of the businesses that had supported him initially were all in bed with one another. They had deep ties to real estate developers who wanted to control the property for themselves. Marcus had been a pawn in their game, and now they were preparing to take him out. The tipping point came on a Wednesday afternoon, when Marcus found himself at Millbrook's local courthouse. He had planned to meet with a judge who was sympathetic to his cause, hoping to get a ruling that would make it harder for the town to block his project. But as he walked into the courthouse, he was greeted by something unexpected. A group of police officers standing by the entrance, led by none other than Officer Daniels. "Mr. Daniels!" Officer Daniels called out with a forced smile. "I've been waiting for you." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. His instincts told him this wasn't just a coincidence, he had walked right into a trap. His chest tightened as he tried to steady his breath. "What's going on, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, despite the unease creeping through him. Daniels stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with something dark and malicious. "You've been a real problem for Millbrook, Marcus," Daniels said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You think you can just waltz in here and start changing things, disrupting the natural order of how this town works? Well, I'm afraid it's not that easy." The air around them grew thick with tension. Marcus could feel the weight of Daniels's words settling on his shoulders, like a looming threat that had finally been made clear. He could see the other officers in the background, all standing with their arms crossed, silently complicit in whatever was about to unfold. "I'm not here to fight you, Daniels," Marcus said, his voice cool but firm. "I'm here to make a difference. If you think you can stop me, you're gravely mistaken." Daniels laughed, his lips curling into a smug smile. "Difference? You're not making a difference, Marcus. You're making enemies, and that's the last thing you want to do in this town." Before Marcus could respond, Daniels' voice dropped, becoming colder. "You're under arrest." The words hit Marcus like a slap in the face. "What the hell are you talking about?" he snapped. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Oh, we've got plenty on you," Daniels said, motioning to the other officers. "We've got evidence of fraud, illegal business practices, and a whole host of other things you've been hiding. You didn't think we wouldn't find out, did you?" Marcus felt his pulse race. This was it. They were going to try to ruin him. They were going to drag his name through the mud, make him look like a criminal, and shut him down for good. "What's this really about, Daniels?" Marcus asked, his voice now laced with frustration. "This isn't about the law. This is about you trying to take me down because you can't stand seeing someone like me succeed." Daniels stepped forward, his face a mask of indifference. "You're damn right it is. And let me make this clear. If you don't stop pushing, if you don't stop making waves, I'll make sure you never see the light of day again. You'll be just another name on a police report, understand?" The injustice of it all was overwhelming. Marcus had always known that there were people who would try to stop him, but he never imagined it would come to this. He wasn't just being targeted because of his business, he was being targeted because of who he was. The color of his skin, his position in the community, his ambition, it all made him a threat to the powers that be. But Marcus wasn't going to go down without a fight. Not now. Not ever. His resolve hardened, and his mind began to race. He knew that if he went along with this, they would have the ammunition they needed to bury him. He had to act fast. "Do what you have to do," Marcus said, his voice steady but resolute. "But I won't go down quietly." He turned and walked away from Daniels, making a beeline for the courthouse doors. The officers tried to stop him, but he pushed past them, determined to get to the judge he had been meeting with. He needed to get the word out. He needed to make sure people knew what was happening before they could silence him completely. Behind him, he could hear the heavy footsteps of the officers pursuing him, but Marcus didn't look back. His mind was focused solely on the task at hand. He had to stay ahead of them, stay in control of the situation. He couldn't let them take him down without a fight. He burst into the judge's office, breathless and frantic. "I need your help now," he said, his voice urgent. The judge, a woman who had shown Marcus nothing but respect in the past, looked up in shock at his sudden intrusion. "What's going on?" she asked, standing up from behind her desk. "They're trying to arrest me. Daniels is behind this. He's trying to sabotage everything I've worked for." The judge's expression hardened, and she quickly closed the door behind them. "I knew this was coming. They've been targeting you for a while, but Marcus, if they arrest you, it'll be over. We need to act fast." The weight of the situation settled over him like a dark cloud. He had always been able to handle challenges before, but this was different. This was bigger. They weren't just coming after his project, they were coming after him, and if he didn't act now, everything he had fought for would be lost. "You have to help me," Marcus said, his voice shaking with the intensity of the moment. "They're not going to stop until I'm gone. I won't let them win." The judge hesitated, then nodded grimly. "I'll do what I can. But you need to be ready. This isn't going to be easy." As Marcus nodded, he felt the first stirrings of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone in this fight as he thought. But he knew one thing for sure. This battle was far from over. The worst was yet to come. The tension in Millbrook reached a boiling point as Marcus Daniels stood in front of Officer Daniels at the town courthouse, the weight of the town's power pressing down on him. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a shadow over the scene as the final confrontation approached the town. A place where Marcus had fought tooth and nail to make a name for himself was now turning against him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, seemed on the verge of slipping away. Marcus had faced many challenges in his life: racism, discrimination, and systemic oppression. But this was different. This wasn't just about surviving in a biased system. This was about fighting back. Not just for his project, but for his right to exist without fear. He had spent years proving that a black man could rise to the top. But now, in the face of his biggest challenge, the forces aligned against him seemed more insurmountable than ever. Officer Daniels stood across from Marcus, his smug demeanor a reflection of the power he thought he held over the situation. The officer's hands were folded in front of him, his posture unyielding, as he regarded Marcus with a mixture of disdain and superiority. "I've been watching you, Marcus," Officer Daniels began, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You think you can just waltz in here and change everything? Disrupt the way things work around here? You've got big ideas. But I've seen your kind before. You don't belong in the seat you're trying to claim." Marcus took a step forward, narrowing his eyes, his body tense with barely contained anger. "My kind. You don't get to define me, Daniels. You think you can intimidate me because I'm not from here? You think because I'm black, I should be content with the scraps you've left me?" Daniels chuckled, but it was a hollow sound, laced with bitterness. "It's not just about race, Marcus. It's about power, and you're out of your depth. You've upset the balance here, and people like you, people who think they can change things, they don't get to walk away unscathed." Marcus felt the adrenaline course through him, his breath coming faster. The fear that had been simmering for days was now a raging fire. He had come to Millbrook to build something real, to make a difference in a town where people who looked like him were often overlooked, ignored, or worse, feared. And now he had to fight to keep what was his, to keep the dream alive. "I'm not going anywhere, Daniels," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "You can't scare me into submission. You've made it clear that you're willing to use whatever means necessary to stop me. But I've been fighting for my whole life. I'm not afraid of you, or your badge, or your lies." The officer's smile faltered for a moment. The mask he wore, so carefully constructed to maintain control over the town's marginalized, was beginning to crack. "I'm not just a cop," Daniel said, his tone growing darker. "I'm a part of something bigger. A system that's been running this town long before you ever showed up. And people like you, who think you can change that, people like you, don't stand a chance." Marcus's blood ran cold as the realization sank in. It wasn't just about the project, it wasn't just about his success. Officer Daniels was part of a larger, more dangerous web. A system of corruption that controlled the town with an iron fist. Daniels's words weren't just a threat. They were a confession. He wasn't just trying to stop Marcus. He was protecting something much bigger, something more sinister. "You've got to be kidding me," Marcus muttered under his breath. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he processed the depths of Daniels's corruption. This wasn't just about him being in the way. This was about the town's power structure being threatened by someone who refused to play by their rules. "I don't need to explain myself to you," Daniels spat, taking a step toward Marcus. "But know this, you will never win. We'll make sure of it. Your little project, it's dead before it even begins. You'll be dragged through the mud, and you'll never get the backing you need. We're already in the process of making sure your reputation is ruined. The people of Millbrook don't want someone like you in charge. They never did." The words hung in the air like a toxic fog, and Marcus felt the weight of Daniel's words pressing down on him. He had never been one to back down. But this felt different. The stakes had never been so high, and the opponent, Daniels and his allies, were playing a game he hadn't fully understood until now. But that wasn't going to stop him. He wasn't going to let Daniels or anyone else destroy everything he had fought for. As he stood there, facing the officer, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. But instead of succumbing to the fear, Marcus felt a fire ignite in his chest. The fight wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had been left behind by a system that didn't care about their struggle, their dreams, their humanity. It was for the future he was trying to build. A future that would give his community a voice, a chance at something better. "You think I'm done?" Marcus said, his voice rising with newfound strength. "I've been underestimated my whole life, but I'm not backing down now. You've made a mistake, Daniels. You think you're the only one who can play this game, but I've got something you don't." Daniels raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by Marcus's sudden defiance. "And what's that?" "I've got the truth," Marcus said, a fire burning in his eyes. "You can try to silence me. You can throw everything you've got at me, but the truth will come out. People will know what you've done. They'll know about your little corrupt network, and when that happens, you'll be the one with nowhere to hide." Daniel's face twisted in anger. "You're playing a dangerous game, Marcus. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Marcus shot back, "and I'm not afraid." As the words left his mouth, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. For the first time, he wasn't just reacting to the situation, he wasn't just trying to survive, he was making a stand that would ripple out far beyond his own life. This wasn't just about one man's fight against corruption. This was about everything that had been swept under the rug, everything that had been hidden in the shadows. "I'm not going anywhere, Daniels," Marcus repeated, his voice unwavering. "You can try to break me, but it won't work. The people who are with me, who believe in what I'm doing, will stand up and will bring you down." Daniels stepped back, his jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Marcus. For a moment, there was a silence between them, heavy, charged with the gravity of the situation. Then, without another word, Daniels turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Marcus stood there, breathing heavily, his heart racing. The confrontation wasn't over, but it was a small victory. He had refused to back down, and that, in itself, was something worth celebrating. But as he walked out of the courthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was just beginning. There were forces at play that Marcus hadn't even fully understood yet, and as he stepped into the cold night air, he knew one thing for sure. The fight for Millbrook was far from over. The stakes were higher than ever. The truth was on his side, but the system was relentless. Whatever came next, Marcus would need to be ready. He had taken his stand, but now, the real war was about to begin. The courthouse doors slammed behind Marcus as he stepped into the cool evening air. He had just come face to face with Officer Daniels, the very embodiment of the town's corrupt system. Marcus's pulse still raced, his heart pounding, as he processed the words they'd exchanged, words that now felt like a direct challenge to everything he had built and fought for. But the confrontation was far from over. It had barely begun. Daniels wasn't just a rogue cop, though he was a symbol of a system that was designed to break people like Marcus, people who dared to challenge the status quo, People who refused to let their race define their worth. People who believed in their dreams and fought for them, even when the odds were stacked against them. Marcus stood tall, his breath steadying as he made his way toward the steps outside the courthouse. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, watching, waiting. Some were hopeful, but most were skeptical. After all, who was Marcus Daniels to think he could take on the system that had held Millbrook in its grip for so long? But Marcus wasn't just some outsider trying to make a mark. He was a man with a purpose, and he had a deep-rooted desire to give Millbrook a future that wasn't tainted by fear, injustice, and hatred. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Mitchell, the one ally Marcus had left in this town, the only person who had stuck by him through it all. He answered quickly. "Marcus, you need to get back here now." Mitchell's voice crackled through the line, laced with urgency. "Daniels is making his move." "What do you mean?" Marcus's pulse quickened. "They're planning something big, something that's going to crush you. You need to act fast." Before Marcus could respond, Mitchell hung up. The weight of those words settled in Marcus's stomach, a deep unease gnawing at him. He had known Daniels was dangerous, but now it was clear that the officer's intentions weren't just about stopping Marcus, they were about silencing him for good. He didn't waste a moment, he knew where Daniels would be next. He had been tracking Marcus's every move, anticipating his next step. But now, Marcus had to turn the tables. If Daniels wanted to play dirty, so be it. He had a few tricks of his own. As Marcus made his way through the alley behind the courthouse, he spotted a group of Daniels' men, officers, local businessmen, and corrupt politicians, all huddled together, whispering among themselves. The sight confirmed his suspicions. The town's power players were conspiring to destroy everything Marcus had worked for. The plan was simple, or so they thought. Use the legal system, the media, and brute force to discredit Marcus and his project, making sure he would never see his dream come to life. They had underestimated him once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. It was time to confront Daniels directly. Marcus took a deep breath and marched toward the group. His footsteps were measured, deliberate. The officers saw him first, their eyes narrowing, their bodies tense as they moved to intercept him. Daniels stepped forward, his lips curling into a smile. "Well, well, look who's come to beg for mercy," he sneered. Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not here to beg, I'm here to finish this." The crowd around Daniels shifted uneasily, but Marcus's voice carried the weight of years of struggle, of watching the corrupt system grind down people like him and his family. The time for silence was over. "I've been watching you, Marcus," Daniels said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're not the man you think you are. You think you can change things here. You think you can make a difference in this town. You're just a pawn, and you don't even know it." Marcus's fists clenched. "I know exactly what you're doing, Daniels. And you're right about one thing. I'm not the man I used to be. I'm not the man you can push around anymore." Daniels's smile faltered for a second, a flicker of uncertainty flashing in his eyes, but he quickly regained his composure. "You really think you can fight this system? You think you can take me down?" Marcus stood taller, feeling the weight of every moment that had led him here. "I'm not just fighting you, I'm fighting for everyone you've oppressed, for everyone who suffered under your watch. You want to know why I'm here? It's because I won't let you win." There was a silence that hung between them, thick and heavy, as the officers around them watched, waiting for the next move. The stakes had never been higher. "I've been patient with you, Marcus," Daniels said, his voice growing colder. "But now, I'm done. You're going to pay for all of this. You'll never get the support you need, you'll never make a difference, you'll be crushed under the weight of your own failure." Marcus took a step forward, closing the gap between them. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the anger that had been simmering for weeks, for months, for years. He had tried to play by their rules, to be the good guy. But now, he understood that the system wasn't designed for him to win. It was designed for him to fail. But he wasn't about to give in. "You've already lost, Daniels," Marcus said, his voice steady. "You've already shown your hand. You can't control this anymore, you can't stop me, and when the truth comes out, people like you won't have a place to hide." For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed Daniels' face. But before he could respond, one of his men stepped forward, a hand resting on the gun at his side. "You've gone too far, Marcus," the man growled. "You don't know what you're up against." Marcus's eyes locked onto Daniels's, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know exactly what I'm up against, and I'm not afraid anymore." The officer's hand twitched at his gun, but before he could make a move, Marcus was already 5 steps ahead. His mind raced, calculating the risks. He knew that if he was going to fight back, he had to act fast. Too many people were watching, too many lives were on the line. And that's when he saw it. The file. It was lying on the ground at Daniel's feet. Half hidden beneath a stack of papers, Marcus's eyes locked onto it, his instincts kicking in. This wasn't just any file. This was the smoking gun, the one thing that would bring everything crashing down. Without thinking, Marcus lunged forward, grabbing the file with one swift motion. As he rose to his feet, the officers around him moved to stop him. But it was too late. The truth was now in his hands. Daniel's face turned pale. "You don't know what you're doing," he spat, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "You think you can just expose this and walk away?" "I'm not walking away from anything," Marcus said, holding the file up in the air. "This is the truth, Daniels. The people deserve to know what you've been hiding, and I'm going to make sure they do." The tension in the air was palpable as the crowd of officers watched, waiting for a response. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The battle between them wasn't over, it had just begun. And Marcus knew that whatever came next, he would have to be ready. The fight was no longer just for him. It was for the people of Millbrook, for everyone who had been silenced by a system designed to keep them down. He wasn't just going to expose the truth, he was going to make sure that it changed everything. But as he stood there, holding the file that could destroy everything Daniels had worked to build, Marcus felt a surge of uncertainty. What would happen next? Would the town rally behind him? Or would the system crush him once and for all? One thing was certain: the next move would be his. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the courthouse as Marcus walked toward the steps, file in hand. The confrontation with Officer Daniels had shaken him, but it had also solidified his resolve. He could feel the weight of the file, the truth he had uncovered, pressing against his palm. What had once been hidden was now exposed. It was time for change. Behind him, Daniels was scrambling. The officers that had stood with him now backed away, their faces blank, uncertain. It was clear now that Marcus's bold move had upended the balance of power that had held Millbrook in its grip for so long. As Marcus made his way toward the street, the heavy air of tension was palpable. A few steps behind, he could hear the shuffling of feet as a small group of supporters approached. It was Mitchell, along with several others who had quietly rallied around Marcus over the past few months, drawn in by his quiet strength and determination. Together, they had begun to form a network, a movement. They had all seen what Marcus was capable of, and now, it seemed the rest of the town was starting to pay attention. "Marcus?" Mitchell called out, jogging to catch up. "You did it, man! They're already talking about it down at the station. Daniel's whole crew. They're losing it." Marcus didn't break his stride, his mind focused on the task ahead. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice firm. "This is just the beginning." As they turned the corner, Marcus spotted a familiar face, a reporter from the local newspaper, holding up a camera. He had been following Marcus's story for weeks now, but Marcus had always kept his distance. But this was the moment. He needed to make sure the truth was known, not just to a select few, but to the entire town. The reporter's camera clicked, capturing the image of Marcus standing tall, holding the file in his hand like a beacon of defiance. "Mr. Daniels," the reporter called, motioning toward him, "I'm not sure you realize the gravity of what's in that file. If what's inside gets out, it's going to change everything." Marcus met his eyes. "Then it's time for change," he said. The tension that had filled the air all afternoon now began to shift. People were starting to gather, drawn by the commotion. Word was spreading quickly, and the truth was seeping into the public consciousness. The crowd grew as people began to understand what Marcus was fighting for, what he had uncovered, and the powerful forces that had tried to silence him. But as the crowd swelled, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Officer Reed standing beside him, his expression unreadable. "You all right?" Reed asked quietly, his eyes scanning the scene. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, I think we've got a chance now. Reed's eyes softened. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about fighting back. You've done more than just expose corruption, Marcus. You've sparked something bigger than all of us. But Marcus knew it wasn't just about exposure, it was about action. It's just the start. Now we need to make sure the system doesn't bury it. We need people to see that this isn't just one bad cop, one corrupt officer, it's the whole damn system, and we can't let it stand anymore. Reed gave a nod of agreement, his eyes focused on the growing crowd. We'll make sure it gets the attention it deserves, and once it does, they won't be able to ignore it. Marcus took a deep breath. I'm ready. Whatever comes next, I'll stand by it. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, press conferences, and meetings with his allies. By the time the sun had fully set, the firestorm of publicity had started to take shape. Local and national media outlets were picking up the story, asking questions, demanding answers. Daniels's reputation, carefully built over years of service, was beginning to crumble under the weight of Marcus's revelations. But even as the media descended on Millbrook, Marcus knew the fight was far from over. The corruption in the town ran deep, and the people who had profited from it wouldn't go down without a fight. As he sat in his office later that night, flipping through the documents that had revealed the full extent of the conspiracy, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was Mitchell again. They're moving fast, Marcus, Mitchell said, his voice tense. We've got a lot of people coming out of the woodwork now, claiming they knew about Daniels's operations, but they're scared. They need protection. Marcus's jaw tightened. I don't care about protecting myself anymore. I care about making sure this never happens again. Mitchell's voice softened. It's going to be a long road, but you've got allies now, Marcus. And you're not alone. As the days passed, Daniels's fall from power seemed inevitable. Investigations were launched, his colleagues began distancing themselves from him, and his supporters in the town started to crumble under the pressure. The evidence Marcus had exposed was undeniable, and the legal and political machinery of Millbrook could no longer ignore the tidal wave of scrutiny. But even as Daniels's world collapsed around him, Marcus couldn't afford to let his guard down. He knew that the fight for justice was never simple. Even if Daniels was brought to justice, the system that allowed him to thrive would remain in place. The work was just beginning. As the weeks passed, Marcus continued his campaign for justice, but he didn't do it alone. The community that had been silent for so long began to speak up. Neighborhood leaders, small business owners, even local teachers. All of them began to see the truth of what Marcus had been fighting for. They had all lived with the same fears, the same prejudices. But now, they saw a path forward. Marcus's message of change resonated deeply with the people of Millbrook. They knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but they also knew that if they didn't stand together, they would be left to face the same oppression for another generation. One afternoon, as Marcus was preparing for another town hall meeting, he received a call from Officer Reed. This time, the news wasn't about Daniels. It was about something bigger, something that Marcus had been dreading. Marcus, it's done. Daniels has fled the town. He's gone, but his allies are still here. We've got them cornered, but we need your help. Marcus's heart pounded. We can't let this slip away. Reed's voice was steady but urgent. We're ready to bring this to the next level. We've got the evidence, but we need the community to back us. Are you ready? Without hesitation, Marcus responded, Let's do it. As the final showdown loomed, Marcus stood before a crowd at Millbrook's town hall, speaking not only for himself, but for every person who had been silenced by the system. His voice, once a whisper against the machine, had become the rallying cry for change. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. Marcus knew the risks. There were still powerful forces that would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But for the first time, the balance of power had shifted. He wasn't just fighting for his own future anymore. He was fighting for a future where justice could prevail, where change could happen. And as he spoke to the crowd, he realized that this was the moment when everything could change. For him, for the people of Millbrook, and for the generations that would follow. The fight was far from over. But Marcus was no longer fighting alone. As the dust settled on the turmoil that had overtaken Millbrook, Marcus stood in front of his reflection in the window of his office, the city skyline just beginning to fade into the early evening haze. his mind drifted back to the moments that had brought him here. The unexpected arrest, the fight against the corrupt system, the moments of doubt, and the triumph of his resilience. Every step he had taken had been leading to this moment, but he knew it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the community that had stood with him, the people who had finally been able to stand up to the forces that had controlled them for so long. Marcus had never set out to be a symbol. He had never asked to be the one to uncover the deep-seated corruption in Millbrook. But through his pain, his determination, and his unwavering belief in justice, he had become just that, someone others could look to for strength. The injustice that had once threatened to break him had now become his platform for change. He'd realized that the fight wasn't just for his own future, but for the future of every person who had been silenced, exploited, or held back by a system that catered to the powerful while crushing the weak. The day he had confronted Officer Daniels and exposed the corruption within the police department marked the turning point of his life. It had been a moment of clarity. He was no longer a passive observer to the injustices around him. He had the power to do something about it. But that realization had come with a heavy cost. As Daniels' empire began to crumble, Marcus had faced resistance not only from the corrupt officers and powerful figures in Millbrook, but also from his own fears. The question of whether he could really succeed had haunted him, but as each new ally joined his cause, as each person found the courage to speak out, Marcus understood one essential truth. Change was not only possible, it was inevitable. In the aftermath, as the legal proceedings against Daniels and the corrupt officers took shape, Marcus found himself at the forefront of a movement he hadn't intended to lead. The truth about the corruption within Millbrook's police force had sparked a fire of awareness. People who had lived in fear, who had been conditioned to accept the abuse of power, were beginning to speak out, standing beside Marcus and demanding justice for those who had been wronged. His own fight for fairness had transcended his personal struggle and became a call for systemic change. The road had been long, and there were still battles to be fought. Even though Daniels had been arrested, there was still a long process of rooting out corruption, and the scars left by years of inequality and injustice wouldn't heal overnight. But the story of Marcus's resilience, his unwavering belief in doing what was right, had resonated with many in Millbrook. It had sparked something deep within the community, something that couldn't easily be extinguished. The sense of powerlessness that had once paralyzed them had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of hope and purpose. Marcus had changed. Where once he had felt like a lone soldier against the tide, he now stood with a coalition of voices, strong, united, and unyielding. He had learned that fighting for justice wasn't just about exposing wrongs, it was about building a new system where those wrongs could no longer take root. The city was waking up, and while it would take time to fully dismantle the deeply entrenched systems of power that had allowed racism and corruption to thrive, Marcus knew one thing for sure. He would be there, on the front lines, to ensure that the fight continued. Through all the hardship, Marcus had discovered the power of collective effort. It wasn't just about the individual, it was about the strength that came from community. From Mitchell, who had been hesitant but supportive from the start, to the people who had rallied behind him without asking for anything in return, Marcus realized that true change came from people coming together, lifting one another up, and demanding something better. He had learned that in the face of systemic injustice, the strength of a single individual, no matter how powerful, was never enough. But the strength of many, united in purpose and vision, could reshape the future. In the aftermath of the victory, Marcus found himself contemplating his next steps. With Daniels' arrest and the exposure of the corruption, Millbrook was at a crossroads. There would be a long road to rebuild trust, both between the community and law enforcement, and between the town's residents. But Marcus had never been one to shy away from hard work. His vision of Millbrook, a place where people were treated with fairness, dignity, and respect, was within reach. But it would take more than just one person to make it a reality. He had learned that systemic change required not only exposing injustice, but actively working to dismantle the structures that allowed it to flourish. Marcus was determined to continue his work as an activist, advocating for fairer policies, holding the system accountable, and ensuring that the people of Millbrook, especially those who had been marginalized, would never have to fight for their rights alone again. His voice had become one of many in the growing movement, and as he prepared to speak at yet another rally, he realized how far they had come. The ground had shifted, and the fight was no longer about survival. It was about creating a new future, one that was just, equitable, and full of promise. For the people of Millbrook, Marcus's journey had become a beacon of hope. His resilience had shown them that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, change was possible. His story had not only uncovered the layers of corruption that had kept the city trapped in its past, but it had inspired a community to take ownership of its future. It had revealed that power could be taken back from the hands of those who misused it, and that justice was not something to be given. It was something to be demanded. As Marcus stepped off the stage after his speech at the rally, he could feel the weight of the journey behind him, but also the promise of what was to come. The struggle wasn't over. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt, but the road forward was clear. And in the faces of those around him, the faces of the people who had stood by him, fought with him, and believed in him, Marcus saw the future of Millbrook, bright and full of possibility. As he turned to leave the rally, the last words of his speech still echoed in his mind. The fight is not over, but it has begun. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that, together, they could overcome anything. The community of Millbrook was awakening, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus believed that anything was possible. The fight for justice would continue, but now it had a momentum, a strength, and a unity that no one could deny. This final section brings closure to Marcus's journey, showing how his resilience led to significant change in his community. His personal growth, the fight against systemic corruption, and the larger societal implications of his actions serve as a reminder that progress, though challenging, is always possible. The story ends with a sense of hope and determination for the future, leaving the audience inspired by Marcus's unyielding commitment to justice and the collective strength of a community ready to rebuild.